Hello and welcome to History Hack's dedicated Second World War air power podcast, Hedge Hopping, with me, Matt Bone. As this is our very first hedge hopping sortie, we cannot look past the aircraft that has come for many to epitomise the conflict in the air, the Supermarine Spitfire. The Spitfire looms large in our collective memory, and today we're going to look at the aircraft in some depth. To guide us on this journey, I am absolutely delighted to welcome to Hedge Hopping broadcaster, author, historian, and pilot, Paul Beaver. Welcome, Paul.
Hey, Matt, thank you. Really pleased to be with you. I mean, this is such a good idea. And to choose the Spitfire first, I mean, I would challenge anyone to tell me that this isn't the most iconic aeroplane in the world. And certainly at the Second World War, we ought to be talking about it more.
Well, you know me, my hawker predilections kind of, this is going to be you selling me as much as anything else, of course. But I suppose we need to ask, how's lockdown been for you? Lockdown 2?
Well, lockdown 2 is no real different from lockdown 1, other than it's colder and wetter and there isn't as much daylight. So I can't do as much in the garden as I did. But that means I've been working, and there's a lot going on because besides doing history, of course, I also do current affairs and strategic analysis. So, you know, it's a mad world out there. Let's put it that way.
So not only have you written extensively on the Spitfire, but I thought I'd open with you were the historical consultant on Spitfire Factory that was on More 4 recently. And in the opening of that, there was a lady about to have her first Spitfire flight. And she said, as she looked out at the aircraft, that it stood for victory and freedom. I suppose for many, she's not wrong, is she? That's what they think of when they see it.
She's spot on. It's really interesting. I mean, I've been lucky enough to fly around Europe in Spitfires, and I can remember two things that really stand out. One is my instructor on the Spitfires, a guy called Eskil Emdal, who's Norwegian, and Eskil and I were in Kjevik in Norway, and somebody came up to us and said, "You keep talking about this as being the British savior, the iconic British airplane." He said, "For us Norwegians, this aircraft absolutely epitomizes what happened in the Second World War. It gave us hope. The first aircraft to fly back, Allied aircraft in 1945 to fly over at Norway was the Spitfire." And that, I think, is just all part of it. Also, I was in Bremerhaven and refueling, and a German guy came up and I said, "Would you like a photograph taken with the Spitfire?" And he said, "Yeah, because, you know, to us here in this part of Germany who didn't vote for the Nazi party, this is the aircraft that gave us our freedom from the Nazis." So wherever you go, I mean, you even get the French telling you that the Spitfire is important to their lives, and you know, and Americans. I mean, the two people who guard their aeronautical, quite rightly, guard their aeronautical heritage closely. They love the Spitfire too, and of course, both Americans and French, and well, you know, what is it, 60-something air forces and air arms in the world flew Spitfires either during the war or after the war.
I think that's a perfect way to introduce her. Why don't we start at the beginning then? So how did a company with no fighter experience come up with this aircraft that we all hold so dear and means so much to everybody?
Well, it's not luck. I think there are two major factors. First of all, the Supermarine had been bought in the 1920s by the Vickers Group, Vickers Armstrong. So that meant that it was a huge organization with lots of money. It also had talented people. And it's not just R.J. Mitchell. I mean, there's a huge mystique and myth around Mitchell. He was the conductor of an orchestra that was Supermarine, either in the design or the technical departments or the engineering departments. And he had on his staff people like Elf Faddy, he had Bill Fear, he had Mansbridge, he had, there's a whole list of people. But I suppose, and you would agree, significantly was a Canadian called Beverly Shenston. Now, Shenston had got his first and second degrees in aeronautics at the University of Toronto, but he couldn't do a PhD anywhere in the British Empire on aeronautics. So he went to Heidelberg, and he ended up in Heidelberg in the late 20s with Herr Dr. Professor Predel, and who I think was his PhD supervisor. And this is the guy who was designing glider wings. So when it comes to the elliptical wing, which is absolutely fundamental to the early Spitfires, at least, you get this amazing sort of, what would you call it, pollinization of German glider wing technology that Shenstone, the Canadian, had put in his mind. And El Fadi said to Mitchell, you've got to employ somebody who understands aeronautics. And Mitchell only didn't like anyone with a degree. There was nobody who'd been to university in supermarine. And he said, well, we've won the Snyder Trophy. We obviously can build good flying boats and seaplanes. Why do I need somebody with a degree? And Fadi said, well, it's the maths, really. He knows how to do the maths. And this is why Shenstone came in and developed the wing, why you had a whole bunch of people who were really good in their specific areas. There are about 150 people involved in making the Type 300 Spitfire, if you like, the second Spitfire, because we should say that the first Spitfire design, mainly by Mitchell, was a complete and total disaster, the Type 224. It had the wrong engine, the wrong design. It didn't do what it was supposed to do. And in the end, of course, it was, it was in a competition, F730, a fighter capable of at least 250 miles an hour, armed with 4 machine guns. Well, it could only carry 2, couldn't do 200 miles an hour. And it was up against a Blackburn, a Bristol, in fact, 2 Bristols, the Gloucester Gladiator, another Gloucester design, a private venture from Hawker, and one from Westland. In the end, the Royal Air Force played safe and went for a biplane, but with an enclosed canopy, the Gloucester Gladiator. And Mitchell had to go back to the drawing board. And this really inspired the team at a time when Mitchell had just been diagnosed with cancer. And it was cancer of the colon, cancer of the rectum, which are just, in those days, completely inoperable other than major surgery. So if you like, all of this spurs Mitchell on and puts this team together, puts Al Fadi in charge of doing the basic work. And the result is the Type 300, which starts to look like a Spitfire.
I think that's the fascinating bit about Mitchell. I think that's where probably Leslie Howard has a lot to answer for. The image of Mitchell. He was not Leslie Howard, was he? He was a northern lad.
He was a lad from Staffordshire. I remember talking to his son Gordon, because in the movie First of the Few, which I have to tell you is from start to finish complete fiction. The only good bit in it, to my mind, is the superb flying of a Mark 5B, I think, from High Post, just north of Salisbury, by Geoffrey Quill, which is some of the best aerial flying. So low, so good in a movie. That's fab. But the rest of it is pretty much rubbish. I mean, Gordon said he used to cringe when, because his mother was there and in the movie and played by an actress who, of course, came from the home counties, dear boy, and probably went to Godolphin or some leading school. And his father, Leslie Howard, was not a lad from Staffordshire. And to a certain extent, that set the whole myth going about Mitchell, working alone tirelessly. Mitchell was better than that. Mitchell knew that he needed the whole team together, and he conducted this orchestra is the best way. In Spitfire people, I call him the great conductor, because I think that's exactly what he did. He brought his skill, his engineering skill, because he was really an engineer, not a designer. He brought that engineering skill, and he took pieces from the Snyder Trophy, the S6B, the winning aircraft there. It isn't, the Spitfire doesn't come directly from it. I mean, the wings are different, the fuselage is different, but it's the first time that people really started looking at inline engines to reduce drag. and they started looking at how do you cool those engines and how do you get really good performance. We have to remember that it was only 20 years before that aircraft couldn't fly over 100 miles an hour. And there you had an aircraft that Stainforth, for example, took to more than 400 miles an hour. And that was 1930. That really, really changed the way people looked at aircraft, not just fighters.
And I think that's a really important point, that sort of level of conductorship that both him and Cam at Hawkers would have, these great people around them that had this melting pot that created these things. It's not a single genius working himself to death for the greater good.
Yeah.
But speaking of that, oh, sorry, go on.
No, I was going to say, I think you're absolutely right. And I think we had to look at without the charismatic leadership of Cam and of Mitchell and these other great designers, they wouldn't have been the designs. But they couldn't do it by themselves. They just literally, there wasn't enough time in the day to do it. So I think you have to always aim off and allow for that. But you also have to look at the fact that Vickers Armstrong gave them the money to do it, and they had enough political clout to do a design, take it to the Air Ministry, and the Air Ministry would say, okay, what we'll do is we'll write a specification around it, F-37-34, 1934, for a high-speed monoplane single-seat fighter. And it says, based on the private venture Supermarine Type 300. This is, you couldn't do that today. The Treasury would go bananas about it. But it's great that, that they did this and they put together this aircraft, because you wouldn't give this aircraft to Supermarine, who made flying boats. And there's a really interesting story, because in 1938, the Air Ministry wrote to Supermarine and said, after you've built the first 310 Spitfires, we're going to give the contract to another company to build a few more. But we think that the future is in twin engine, 4-cannon fighters, and you're going to build the Bristol Beaufighter down there. So what then happens is really ridiculous, is that a civil servant sees a copy of the memo and goes, well, I won't bother to deliver any more Merlins then. So you get this hiatus in the production of the Spitfire. We could have had another 400 Spitfires in service in the Battle of Britain had there not been this hiatus in 1938. And the problem that Supermarine had is they couldn't productionize the aircraft. Today we have manufacturing engineers, we have production engineers who specialize in doing this. But Supermarine had only built aircraft as a cottage industry. I mean, if you look at the RAF Museum, has got a flying boat there from the Supermarine stable. That hull is the most beautiful working of mahogany you could ever see. And that's what they did. But they had to learn how to productionize.
Because, as I said, my first question, that they were not a company that made fighters to any degree. This is a departure for them. And you look at, I'm going to bring Hawkers up again. They were pumping them out for everybody at the same time.
Well, they would. You see, this is the interesting thing. You have to look at the aircraft industry at the time. Lots of small companies, and they were doing contracts around. I mean, Gloucester built Hurricanes, and people built different aircraft. Ownerships changed. You had all of this going on, and of course, central to the story as well is Lord Beaverbrook. 4 days after Churchill takes power, he's made Minister of State for Aircraft Production, a cabinet office seat, and told, get it going. And he did. If you look at the figures, suddenly, instead of producing about, I don't know what it was, say about 100 Spitfires a month out of Supermarine, they're into 160, then 180, then 200. And he brings in the Castle Bromwich factory, which starts, it's a build to print. They did no development work, they just built aircraft there. And then you have all of that development of the Spitfire going on when the Germans tried to destroy, and almost did, the Woolston factory of Supermarine. And they move out to Hursley and Southampton. You had the dispersed factories in Trowbridge and Salisbury and Reading and Basingstoke and Winchester and whatever. I mean, the story is fantastic. It really is. A lot of it, though, Matt, a lot of the story is luck and prepared minds. I mean, if it hadn't been for um, people being prepared, so all of our aircraft factories nearly are in the south. They were at Weybridge, they were at Southampton, they were at Rochester. They were initially they were in target for the French because, of course, in 1932 the threat was still the French. You know, the largest air force in the world. Nobody expected the Germans to be able to get anywhere except perhaps across the North Sea, and there was no Luftwaffe in Germany officially until 1935. So you know the threat was different. And one thing I just want to say about the Spitfire is it was not designed as a dogfighting fighter. Like the Hurricane, it was designed as a bomber destroyer. And that's why initially the armament was so puny, because all it was supposed to do was shoot down a bomber. And it wasn't supposed to be an aircraft that got into combat, because by 1936 we knew the Luftwaffe was there, but Germany wasn't going to be able to fly single-engine fighters over Britain, for goodness sake. I mean, the French had the largest army, second largest navy, and the largest air force in the world. And France was resolute. It wasn't going to fold in 22 days or whatever it took.
And that's a huge, huge point, which I think is in the sort of public mythology of it, is that specification, that design of her is sort of counter to what we know the aircraft as being. The night in the sky dancing with Me-109s. It was never meant to be that, but it very much became this remarkable dogfighter, which we will get back to shortly. Because there's one question I always love talking, especially to you, about, is that initial development, because it was not a war winner out of the box, was she?
No.
Those few years before the outbreak of war was a hectic time to make her ready.
Yeah, there was a lot of work that had to be done. I mean, there's a lot of mythology as well about that. When Mutt Summers takes the aircraft up, and I think, if I remember correctly, his first flight was about 8 minutes. He came back and said, "Don't touch a thing." Now everyone thinks that means, the aircraft was perfect. What he meant was, don't touch anything, because we need to do some work on it, and we need to be able to tweak it from there. I mean, that first flight, Rolls-Royce, with whom Supermarine had a really good close working relationship, they sent people down from the car part of Rolls-Royce. They then owned Rolls-Royce motor cars. And they polished the airframe, and they polished the rivets. They did all sorts of things to make the aircraft fly well, and it would fly faster. To me, it's absolutely fascinating that this aircraft, it still looks okay. I mean, if you look at the aircraft, I'm going to reach behind me and get my copy of Spitfire Evolution, which of course every Spitfire person should have. And I trust
fantastic tome.
Yeah, but if you look at it there, the Type 300 looks like a Spitfire. It's got an enclosed cockpit. It's got the Merlin engine that's inline. It's got an elliptical wing. It's got a very graceful fuselage, and that's the key. It's this using the skin of the Spitfire's fuselage to be part of the construction, which made it lighter, more agile. And the wing, the way that El Fadi had put together the wing by using concentric D sections to give that leading edge. This is all clever stuff. And it's all coming from experience, because these engineers and designers and developers were all highly experienced. Interestingly, Mitchell came from the steam engine world. Fadi came from Parsons steam boilers up in Newcastle. Engineering is engineering. If you've got an engineering degree, you can turn your hand to anything. And I think that's remarkable. But what, again, problem they had was that they didn't know how to put it into mass production. And we needed hundreds of these aircraft. We didn't just need a few. And it wasn't, you didn't have the time to do what every other company was doing, which was making the aircraft by hand. You're using the English wheel to shape the cowling. All of these things that actually today are in very short supply, because restoring Spitfires is in itself an art. It takes 3 or 4 years to restore a Spitfire, perhaps longer. They didn't have time to do that.
Yeah, going off topic slightly, I think if anyone's ever lucky enough to get up close to an actual Second World War Spitfire and compare her to a new build, the build quality of them is quite different.
It is. I mean,
you look at MH434, and I don't think there's a panel on her that lines up when you compare her to one of the new ones.
But the skill of Bickerton Heritage Hangar or Arco at Duxford is that the people working there have got the time and have the inclination to make the aircraft better. And they are. These restored Spitfires are, the motor cars are the same. They are now beautiful engineering masterpieces, and they really work. But I find it fascinating that most of the Spitfires in Britain that fly are Mark 9s. Most of them have got the Packard 266 Merlin engine, which originally was built in America. And that, I think, is fascinating. We could go into all sorts of details. The good news is that Rolls-Royce are getting back into heritage and are going to look after Merlins and Griffin engines. And that's going to be a huge weight off everyone's shoulders because the safety governance of that is now in place. But everyone should go and see a Spitfire. Everybody has a connection with the Spitfire. When I do lectures about Spitfires, people come up to me and say they've got a connection. It might have been that their parents or grandparents worked on them. Even if they've just seen one, they recognize it. But sometimes they think Hurricanes are Spitfires, which is a bit of a problem.
We won't get into because we won't get into that because that will upset me.
Yeah, I thought so.
So the Spitfires moment really comes in the summer of 1940 with the Battle of Britain. We will just mention there was more hurricanes involved, but we will leave the hurricane out of this conversation.
No, we shouldn't. We shouldn't. We should actually put this in context, I think.
Fantastic. I'll send you the £20 for that.
Yeah, no, we should. So let's get the sort of throwaway slogans out. 52% of all enemy aircraft down between the 10th of July and 31st of October 1940 were down by hurricanes. And that includes Spitfires, Blenheims, Gladiators, Sea Gladiators, Skewers, you name it. Oh, and barrage balloons and anti-aircraft guns. So, but there were 39 squadrons of Hurricanes because there were more Hurricanes. Hurricane first flew, 6 months before the Spitfire, and was in service quicker because the method of manufacture was different. You could build three Hurricanes in the time it took to build one Spitfire because it was old. It had stretch canvas over frames, and it was dead easy for people to do. They all knew how to do it. The key to the Spitfire and the Battle of Britain to me is we didn't win the Battle of Britain because of the Spitfire. And another myth we need to dispel. We may well have lost if we didn't have the Spitfire. And then you get to these interesting things. And you get it in the Battle of Britain movie. Okay, the Spitfires take the fighters, the Hurricanes take the bombers. Yes and no. Remembering a Hurricane could outturn a Bf-109 or a Spitfire at low level. Remembering that the Hurricane kills on fighters are about the same as the Spitfire kills. So that, this is not a second-class airplane, the Hurricane, but the Spitfire had the advantage of having a faster climb rate, something like 1,100 feet a minute, which meant in the combat climb to the patrol line, Maidstone, Canterbury from Biggin Hill, you have 10 minutes to get height. It could get 15,000 feet, and the Hurricane was there at about 10 or 11, and that's where the bombers were. So naturally, you go for the bombers. The Hurricane also has its machine guns grouped. They're 4 together on each wing, and if you've got concentrated lead, whereas the Spitfire's got its machine guns evenly spaced, well, not quite evenly, but spaced out, distributed down the wing, which is not quite such an effective punch if you don't have your guns zeroed. So there are all sorts of things like this, and it's probably in the Spitfire easier to see out, particularly when they started to change. They put the Malcolm hood on. They started to get an Austin 7 rear view mirror, that comes in. You know, there are lots of things. And then you get 100 octane fuel. And that's British. It's not American. It's British. The great thing the Dutch did for us in 1940, when Rotterdam was attacked, they loaded 2 tankers with 100 octane fuel from the great oil refineries in Rotterdam and sent them to Britain. And that was enough to get us going. So there are all those things. I mean, you know, it isn't just the Spitfire, it's the way you use it and what you do with it.
I think the 100 octane fuel, that's probably a show in itself, because that was the difference, considering the German B4 and C3 fuels were really bitsers of all kinds of different things thrown in.
Well, the Germans were on sort of something like 87 octane fuel. I mean, you know, and you look at this, the Battle of Britain, which in itself is worth a show. The Battle of Britain, the Germans were using fields in France to maintain their aircraft. They didn't have the serviceability we had. The other great secret of the Battle of Britain was number 1, number 2, number 3 civilian repair units. And off the top of my head, that's Cowley, it's somewhere in the Midlands, and it's Glasgow, where they would take war-weary, battered, broken Spitfires and Hurricanes and put them back in service. I mean, old Tom Neal would say in 249 Squadron at Northfield, this is Hurricanes, you know, they'd start in the morning with 12, they'd have 8 left at the end of the day. The next morning had 12 again. How do they have 12? Because the civilian repair unit had worked. If you go to Oxford and you drive on the Eastern Ring Road, there's the BMW factory owned by the Germans. It's actually number 1 civilian repair unit. And the road you go on, the ring road north-south, is a runway, and the road that goes past you go over a flyover is the east-west runway. And the Germans didn't know about it. The Germans, intelligence failure. The Germans did not bomb it. And there's so many things that the Germans got wrong. We've gone away from the Spitfire, I know, but to me, it's the context of this which is important. Remembering every German fighter pilot who was shot down by a Spitfire, even though it was blatantly clear it's a Hurricane. Snobbery.
And I suppose it's that psychological effect, isn't it? It's so striking. It is the thing. So therefore, I couldn't have possibly been shot down by anything different.
And you have to remember the mystique that had started in the 30s, almost because the Spitfire wasn't entering service. I mean, it didn't enter service till August 38. Its first appearance was at Marshall's of Cambridge at Empire Air Day, when the aircraft were on their way to Duxford. And that was the operational conversion unit and trials unit, number 19 Squadron. 3 aircraft went to Cambridge, and everyone went, wow, this is an amazing airplane. Went to Hendon after that, and we started to show off about it. If you read local newspapers, like I did when I was researching for Spitfire People, I was looking for mentions in the factory areas. Everyone mentioned Spitfires. You don't hear a word about Hurricane. So I thought, well, I'll just see what's in Weybridge Courier or the Langley Gazette or whatever. Absolutely nothing. And you have the Spitfire Fund. You don't have the Hurricane Fund. So you have 1,500 Spitfires, all really coming through the Battle of Britain, which are bought by people spending £5,000. And I like to quote, 23 bought by the people of Argentina, neutral and not in the war. There's all sorts of interesting pieces that come out. I mean, the Spitfire, as I say, touches everybody. All of us have had grandparents or parents or great-grandparents who gave money for the Spitfire Fund. I don't suppose there was a single person in Britain or the Commonwealth who didn't, and other countries as well.
It's incredible that the mythologizing of the aircraft starts almost at the beginning and only grows through it. The thing that always sticks in my mind is that the Battle of Britain was exactly what the Spitfire and the Hurricane were designed for. Essentially point defense in a coordinated system.
Yeah.
And yet the next year, if we move forward a little bit, they're immediately centered into the same sort of environment that the Germans were operating in, which is rodeos and things which are not what it should be used for.
Trafford Leigh-Mallory decides to lean over the channel, and we lose more pilots and more aircraft than we did in the Battle of Britain. And some of the named Spitfires, like Moonraker, for example, the Wiltshire Spitfire from West Yorkshire, from West Wiltshire, gets 8 days in service because it goes off and starts going down and across the channel and coming back, as the Germans found, coming back over that water. And we were doing in winter as well. It's just mind-blowingly bonkers. And then we send them, of course, in 42, they go to Malta, where again, they show how good they are at point defense. And
Yes.
This is what it's designed for. People say, oh, the Mustang's a much better aircraft. You go to Berlin, fight for 20 minutes and fly back again. Yeah, that's what it was designed for. That it did, that's what it said on the box. And the Spitfire box, it doesn't say that. The Spitfire box says day, fighter, interceptor.
Yeah, it's that much maligned quote, which is, the Mustang couldn't do what a Spitfire did, but it did it over Berlin. And you just shake your head and say, well, there's
yes and no, and yeah, and you can make a whole, Merlin engine, the Malcolm hood, all of the intakes, all the design stuff. I mean, the Mustang, designed by a German in America with Brit technology, built by a company that had only built trainers before. I mean, there's a great analogy actually, the Supermarine and Spitfire with North American building the Mustang. It's amazing what you can put your hand to if you're an engineer.
Very much so, yeah. And I think this is a great part to talk about engines, because I think for most people, the two Spitfires that they probably most know would be the Mark V and the Mark IX. Mm-hmm. Both of which had the interim tag placed on them, because the ones that were supposed to come next, the Mark III and the Mark VIII, weren't ready. So let's take the Mark V to start with. Why did it have this interim tag, and why did it have such longevity?
Well, I look at the Mark V, actually, I'd be pretty curious. I haven't flown a Mark V, but I'd say it was probably my favorite Spitfire. It just has the proportions right. The Merlin 45 in the front is just slightly bigger, and it just balances it in my mind. So I really like 5, and depending on the wing, A, B, C, Bauder always flew the A model because he liked machine guns. The B had cannon, which were more effective. You start looking at this. You look at the wing configurations on the Spitfire. That's a whole subject in itself. And then you get the 9, which is a fill-in aircraft, which turns out, Winkle-Brown said the 9 wasn't the best Spitfire, but it was the most effective combat Spitfire. So he flew it in combat over occupied France in 1943, because the Canadians that he was going to train in deck landing, because they thought they might have to use the Canadians were highly regarded fighter pilots in the middle 40s there, in the middle part of the war. They might have to do deck landings on carriers without any experience. So he was sent down to do some training with them. And he ends up, they said, well, we'll do that if you come on flight with us. And so he goes in a Mark V, he goes in a Mark IX, and gets into combat with FW-190s and stuff, which for a test pilot was really useful. But putting one of our test pilots over occupied territory is mind-blowingly bad OPSEC. It really is. But there you go. So I rely on his diaries on this, and he believes that the 9 was the effective aircraft. It had everything right. His favorite Spitfire, of course, was the 14, which he just said, with that Griffin engine, it was the best aircraft of the war. It had best fighter of the war. It had a tactical Mach number that was way above anybody else, particularly the Mustang. So he rated Spitfire 14, and then the Dora, the D4 Focke-Wulf 190, and then the P-51D Mustang. And as a man who flew 487 types of aircraft, I sort of go along with his judgment on this. It is really, really interesting that people, and of course, more Mark 9s are actually built. I think it was 10,000, half the Spitfires built.
Not bad for an interim
model. Not bad for an interim model. But the thing was that this, Mitchell knew in 1936, when he was terminally ill, that the Spitfire was going to need to be replaced by something. And he'd started work on a 2-engine single-seat aircraft. It looks very much like the de Havilland Hornet, with 4 cannon in the front, as being, its replacement. He expected that replacement in 1942. Well, of course, he dies in 1937, just after the first flight and before productionization of the Spitfire. So we can't lay that at his door.
I would highly recommend looking up the Supermarine Type 324, because that is a beautiful aircraft that never flew.
And people, I think, from 44 onwards, the Spitfire was starting to show its age. Now, what were there after that? There were about another 50 variants of, different configurations. But the Spitfire's starting to show its age, and it's still doing a good job. And then it starts to do ground attack, which it really wasn't designed for. I mean, we've got a family connection with Rolf Arneberg, the highest scoring Norwegian ace, who dies the day after he's supposed to stop flying because he has one more go, and takes a Spitfire a 9 up and strafes a German airfield and gets taken out by light flak. I mean, from 44 onwards, the Spitfires have been taken out by flak. They won't be taken out by fighters because the Germans didn't have the pilot skills, and didn't have the fuel, and didn't have the numbers to do it. And the Spitfire was still supreme. It was still a 400-mile-an-hour plus fighter aircraft. It could still turn. It could still climb. But if you look at the difference between the Mark I or Mark II and up to the Mark 47 Seafire, it still looks like a Spitfire. But I remember the guys at Kennett Aviation at Old Warden, who restore Seafires, telling me about the only thing that's common between the Mark I and the 47 are the rudder pedals. There's not much else there that's the same. And if you look at it, I'm looking at them now. They look like Spitfires. In fact, you look at the cover of Spitfire Evolution. It's got 7 Spitfires on it because I wanted to show the evolution and the teardrop canopies and the cut down rears, hulls, and the fact that they put a rester hook on the aircraft. I mean, the naval version, the Sea Hurricane, I have to give you, was better as a naval fighter than the Seafire. At Salerno, they lost more Seafires on the 3 carriers from deck landing accidents than they did from enemy action.
There's traits of the Spitfire which don't really meld well for the sea, do it? But just to jump onto ground attack for a second with my my fascination of the role with the Typhoon. But the Spitfire in itself is wholly misdesigned for ground attack, because a lot of its sort of vulnerable bits are on the bottom.
Yeah, vulnerable bits on the bottom. Wing loading's wrong. Pilot view. It's not robust. I don't think it's robust enough. I mean, the Spitfire is really good at altitude. And if you look at, you get some of the Mark 7 with the extended tip interceptions of Junkers 82Ps at 35,000 feet or more. And, and you get Tony Martindale at Farnborough taking a Spitfire to 42,000 feet to see if he can break the sound barrier in a dive, which he breaks the Spitfire in the dive. The bits of the aircraft fall to pieces. But luckily, he shows the skill of Royal Air Force test pilots. He manages from somewhere over the Hog's Back near Farnham to land at Farnborough on the runway with the wheels down so that they can look at the aircraft. And they discover, oh, that's really interesting. The wings have swept back. They've been forced back. Oh, perhaps that's something we should examine. Yeah,
I think we need to get together to just talk about test pilots, because those, especially the Second World War chaps, they are an incredible
500
group.
Test pilots and flight test engineers died between 1940 and 1960. There's a memorial at Farnborough to them. This was a high-risk business.
It's a beautiful little memorial which no one ever goes to. Which is a shame. Of course, Phil Lucas won the George Medal, bringing prototype Typhoon back when it tried to split itself into
Yeah.
two pieces. So I'm going to say something controversial here,
Hmm.
because I think the big change to the Spitfire was the introduction of the Griffin, which is the next big Rolls-Royce V12 power plant. I actually prefer the look of the Griffin,
Ooh,
the Griffin
controversial,
Spitfires,
isn't it?
and especially the low back ones. You know,
Mm.
the sort of low back 14s. I think that straight line from the nose to tail and the teardrop canopy, there's something special about that. And
Well, I'm looking at an FR Mark 14E with the E-wing, which is the combination of machine gun and cannon. And particularly, I'm looking at this 28th Squadron post-war in the book. And if you're following the book, it's page 51. And it's beautiful. It is a beautiful aeroplane. I actually, now this is heresy, I actually prefer the sound of a Griffin to the sound of a Merlin. So, you know, the Mark 19, for example, the Rolls-Royce Spitfire, you know, I think that's a beautiful aircraft. And you can hear it 5 miles away. It's just fantastic. But who in their right mind decides it's going to go around the other way? You know, who in their right mind? Everyone's got used to holding the rudder down for takeoff in the Merlin because the propeller turns to the left, and then you get the one that the Griffin turns to the right. So, Joy Lofthouse, the most gorgeous lady who sadly passed away about 5 years ago, ATA delivery pilot, delivered 400 Spitfires, told me about her first flight in a Griffin, picking it up from Eastleigh. Nobody told her that this was different. So and in her pilot's notes, had just given her the speeds. You know, pilots fly by numbers. You know, you want to know your stall, your approach speeds, all of this stuff, and you memorize them. So I can remember almost every aircraft's number sort of grouping I've got. I have to say that if I haven't flown for a while and I'm flying suit, I tend to write them down, but on my flying suit. But the interesting thing to me about this from her perspective is she said that so she gets into the Spitfire, and she gently opens the throttle as you're supposed to, and it starts to move. Oh, she's a bit strange. So she applies rudder. She applies the wrong rudder, of course, because she thinks it's a Merlin, and the aircraft goes off at 90 degrees between two hangars. And she said, this was fine. I'd managed to get back into control. And then I saw the Southampton barrage of all the balloon cables. And she said, this is the stage when even a lady is allowed to swear. And so she sort of, she gets airborne, gets to altitude and sorts herself out, as she said. And this is the lady who said to me, when I said, can you sum up in one sentence the Spitfire? And she said, oh, yes. She said, that's really easy. She said, the Spitfire in the air is a well-bred lady, not a single vice. On the ground, it's a right bitch. And I thought, coming from a 90-year-old lady, it was just fantastic. And it really does sum it up, because you don't finish flying the Spitfire. It's not the landing, it's not taxiing in, it's not shutting down. It's when you're having your first beer in the bar that you've actually officially stopped flying it, because it has a terrible tendency to do things to you.
I think, you know, that the myths and the thoughts about it is, you always hear the line that you wear a Spitfire as much as you fly them. These are high performance, very delicate aircraft to fly. You know, you fly them. What are some of the quirks that you noticed when you were in a Spitfire that sort of stood out to you that maybe made you think, I'm glad I didn't have to do this in combat?
Oh, there are a number of things. I mean, first of all, you have to remember a Spitfire is there not for its beauty, it's there to kill. This is an air defender. So this is designed to kill the enemy and stop them from killing us. It's a war machine. And we can eulogize it and say how beautiful it is, because today we don't need to use it in service. I think that's absolutely right. There are things about it. So I've also flown the Mustang, and the first thing you notice about the Mustang is it's designed for big Americans. It's got a comfortable cockpit where, strangely enough, all the instruments and levers are in the right place. So who in their right mind decided that it's an engineer, decided that the Spitfire, you have to, on takeoff, to retract the undercarriage, you have to change hands. So you take off with your left hand on throttle quadrant and your right hand on the stick, and you get airborne. Then you've got to do something about flaps and undercarriage. That's on the right-hand side. So then you have to take your left hand off the throttles and stick it onto, making sure you've done up the friction nut, onto the stick, and then move your right hand across and start dealing with flaps and undercarriage in a window of speed. So you'll notice that even some of the great exponents of the Spitfire, like Rats Ratcliffe and Eskill Endell and Matt Jones, when they take off, you do notice there's just a little wobble. And if you're a really low-time pilot, there's a big wobble in the aircraft as you gain control again. And there's things on the approach as well. When you're coming into land, you've really got to do this curving fighter approach, the sort of Winkle Brown style, getting onto a carrier deck approach, because you do, with that great nose, lose the front. And it's difficult to taxi. And it's got narrow truck undercarriage. And the flaps have only got one setting. It's either down or up. You've got a whole bunch of things like this to remember. But is it like, as Geoffrey Wellen would say, putting on an old and trusted overcoat? Yep, exactly. Is it exhilarating? Yep. So the most exhilarating thing, I think, is coming down the Friesland Islands below a certain height, seeing some people on the beach, sticking up the nose, going around, doing a victory roll, and watching nice Dutch people waving at you, or calling up Den Helder military and saying, could you fly through the military zone in order to, because you're limited on fuel. Yeah, it's possible as long as you fly down the main runway. And you're cleared not above 200 feet. And that sort of stuff. And it's like flying any nice old airplane, and it could be a Tiger Moth for that matter. It could be a Harvard, whatever it is. If you use that in the call sign, London Information, this is Spitfire request or something. Oh, Spitfire, and there's a silence on the radio. So everyone else says, oh, it's a Spitfire around. It is fantastic. And it doesn't matter if you're on the front or the back, if you're a two-seat or a single seat, if you're flying with somebody, or it's the whole mystique. You're in the Spitfire. You're looking out on the elliptical wing. And what could be better? I mean, I'd challenge anyone to say that it isn't, inside or outside, the most beautiful airplane. Because most aircraft, beautiful aircraft you fly in, don't look as good inside as they do when you're standing on the ground. But the Spitfire does. It just is, even when it's been desecrated with having a second cockpit and having moved the first cockpit 89 inches further forward to maintain the CG, it's still a pretty fine looking machine. And I just don't think anyone's come up with anything quite like it that sense. I mean, I'm a bit biased. I quite like the Beaver, but then that's because I used to display it in the army. That's an airplane built for it. If people don't know it, it's a big radial engine, high wing box with some wings on that can land in about 70 meters and on floats. It's absolutely magical.
Large part of my childhood was watching beavers up in the mountains in Canada.
Yeah, absolutely. So you would have seen them, and they're still around now. And I'm in a movie called Immortal Beaver with Harrison Ford, and a few of us spent a day in Downsview in Canada at first flew, including, we had everyone there actually. We had a whole bunch of Canadians there, and fighter racers and whatever, Spitfire pilots all, and we all eulogized about this airplane. It's just really a box, very big engine, it makes a beautiful noise. But we digress. So the Spitfire starts to run out of capacity, but we haven't talked about photo reconnaissance. We haven't talked about making the wing wet into a Bowser, so you can fly from Benson to Peenemünde on the Baltic coast, spend 12 minutes photographing, come back over Berlin, still have some film, so take another 2 minutes of film down the center of Utter den Linden or whatever, and then just about, because the wind's changed, managing to get to Marston Heath in Suffolk. And that's not unusual. It's almost an everyday occurrence. And, if it weren't for Spitfire PRs, we wouldn't have known about the V1, the V2. We wouldn't have known a lot about what was happening in Normandy. And then, the beautiful FR Spitfire photographs of going down the beaches in the Pas-de-Calais in Normandy as German troops at low tide are fitting the Dragon's Teeth and the Belgian gates and all this stuff, and seeing them all run. And this is live footage, it's time footage from the Spitfire as it goes down. So few of them were shot down. They had to be ambushed to be shot down. It is remarkable. So, it's not just niche, it is pretty much all round. There weren't Hurricane PR versions, of course, but they did have tank busters. So I'll give you that.
And of course, just to keep Hawker's end up here, the Typhoon did have a TAC-R version, even though there's only 6 of them. I can throw that in as well. They did put a camera on it. It wasn't very good because it was vibrating too much. I couldn't get a picture out of it. I think probably in this strange 2020, the most visible Spitfire is a PR Spitfire, is Arco's NHS Spitfire, which I think has been doing sterling work all year with raising money for
what a brilliant idea.
NHS.
What a brilliant idea.
Yeah.
What is fundamentally our icon today's National Health Service? It's our religion. What was our religion 80 years ago? The Spitfire. But bring the two together. I mean, John Remain's brilliant at putting that together. When I first heard about it, I went, oh yes, I wish I'd thought of that. It is so good. It is so clever. It is so the right thing to do. But we do see Spitfires, and of course it's been really sad. I'm a flying display director. We've had no or very few flying displays. I do a lot of work for the Boltley Flight Academy at Goodwood, and there's been very little work that's been done, which is so sad because we love the Spitfire.
I've had a few lucky associations having worked on the Typhoon, but there's something special about being at an air show when the first Spitfire of the day fires up and then flies past, because everything does stop and everybody watches it. Everybody has a smile on their face, and it is something.
And there are now more flying Spitfires, or there will be when we start flying again, because a lot of them are grounded at the moment. Because if you're not flying, there's no point in insuring your aircraft, etc. There are now more flying Spitfires than there were 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. And there will be more. There will still be more. If you look at the Spitfire factory, which is what you best can describe Biggin Hill Heritage Hangar. I mean, that TV series that's just been on really shows that. There they are this year. What have they got? They put a Greek aircraft back into the air. They put a Russian aircraft back into the air. They've worked on the BBMF aircraft. They've done, they're still doing flights. That's real Spitfire City at Biggin Hill. And if you live anywhere near, I'm sure you're used to seeing it. You live in Sevenoaks, you get Spitfires all the time. I was down the Capel of Thurn Battle of Britain Memorial just before the second lockdown, filming a podcast for the Army Flying Museum on the Spitfire, on the Battle of Britain, and standing there doing a piece to camera, and I heard this noise, and there's a Biggin Hill Spitfire. It comes hurtling across the top. I mean, what can you do except go, oh my, there's a Spitfire. I wish I planned that, but I hadn't. And just watching it, and then get back to talking about the Battle of Britain. I'm glad to say it's in the program.
Wonderful. There's a couple of questions really that, because our love for the aircraft wasn't really there in the middle 50s when she stopped her service with the RAF. What happened to them all? This is the question we get with the Typhoon a lot, is why did we get rid of them?
Yeah, well, why do we get rid of everything? Room, expense. People tend to not bother. There must have been 12,000 Spitfires left. There were always sold some, places like Burma and Thailand and the French. And nearly all the European Air Forces started again with Mark 9s, taking them from their squadrons that had been formed during the French 340 series squadrons, or the 320 series squadrons, the Dutch and the Belgians and the Norwegians. But then I think people were fed up with the war in the end in the 40s, wanted to get rid of it. Onto the jet. This is the new place to go. Let's just get rid of them. A few sensible people kept some bits and some spares, but I can remember when there was probably only one Spitfire left flying, Gulf Alpha India Delta uniform, I think. I remember as just about a teenager, cajoling my mother to drive me to somewhere to see it, so I could put it in my logbook of airplane numbers, because like all good historians, I started as a regispotter. And I think you look at all of that and you say, well, why didn't we keep more? Well, luckily, at Biggin Hill, they kept 3 Mark 19s, which became the backbone of the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight, and they found others. We're able today to take them off. There's not a plinth with a real Spitfire left, I don't think, anywhere, perhaps South America, perhaps in Burma. But, aircraft in India, the Indians have got their Spitfire. If it isn't flying, it's about to fly. Everyone wants a Spitfire now. If you look at some of the pictures of aircraft graveyards, why didn't we keep some of the German aircraft? Some of those amazing technology designs that we could use as teaching tools. Because one of the great things about the Spitfire is, if you, like me, are rather enthused about teaching children about engineering and maths and technology and science, STEM, the Spitfire is a really good thing to do. And to take them around the Spitfire and get them cleaning it, so they get to understand the lines and this sort of thing. If that's allowed, I'm never really sure if these things are. Get them in, up close and personal. I think that's important. We took the late Mark Hanna and a group of us took some aircraft to Poland in 1997, I think it was. And in Demblin, I think it was, we had little old ladies breaking through the crowd. There were no barriers. People hadn't thought of that. Little old ladies breaking through the crowd and would sort of shuffle up to the Spitfire, touch it, genuflex, and say tack, tack, because they saw it as the liberation of their countries. And even with all of that, we destroy Spitfires. So we destroy Spitfires in interesting ways. The Ministry of Supply decided that there would be too many engines around, so they would destroy the engines by running them with the sump cap off, so that they would leak oil and seize up. Or I remember the late Jim Pierce saying that when he was delivering Spitfires to St. Athan, he was told, if you don't make the first approach and you are at all concerned, go out over Cardiff Bay at 5,000 feet and jump out, because we don't need the Spitfires anymore. And today people are finding Spitfire wrecks to get the plate so they can rebuild the aircraft, because Peter Monk at Biggin Hill can rebuild you a Spitfire around a plate. And so if you've got the plate, you've got a Spitfire.
It's that forward-looking, I guess for me, it was always that forward-looking moment, isn't it? That let's move on. We have something new, and let's forget about the darkness that had overtaken us for us.
Well, we're still doing it today. I mean, people talk about restoring aeroplanes to flying condition. You could easily do that generation up to about the Spitfire, because they're easy to maintain and easy enough to fly. The Hurricane, you need no more than 100 hours of tail drag flying to safely fly a Hurricane solo, because there is a 2-seater now, but there wasn't a 2-seater a few months ago. So you can do that. You can't do that with a modern aircraft. And Bruntingthorpe's found that problem. The Royal Air Force have found the problem with keeping old aircraft. The Vulcan, classic example. You just can't do it. We could have done more. I wish we'd kept more First World War aircraft. But, people are rebuilding them. I saw the other day somebody's rebuilding a Vickers gun bus from scratch, from the plans. And you think, oh, bloody hell. Well, first of all, you think, why? Secondly, you think, is this guy won the pools? Because it must be costing a fortune. But people are keen. Aeroplanes should be in the air. If they're museum examples, they should be like Duxford and Biggin Hill and other places do, Sywell does, is you put these aircraft into the air. I don't agree with this, we put it away and polish it in a museum. Airplanes are designed to fly, tanks are designed to drive, ships are designed to go on the sea.
There's something different about an aircraft that actually flies. You compare a Spitfire to one in, say, at Hendon to one that's at Duxford, which has a little bit of oil dripping out of it, has that wonderful smell. It's night and day, really, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And I don't care what people say about, it's not an original Spitfire because it's had the wings have been redone or whatever. No, it's not, but it's done with the same loving care, and actually it's probably safer and will last longer. I mean, what does the RAF say? That the Lancaster will last another 50 years. You know, great. That means my grandchildren will see it. I don't think I will. I'll be very old. But you know, my grandchildren will. So that's good.
To all those who are keeping these aircraft in the air, thank you so
Oh,
much.
absolutely. It
Yes.
doesn't matter who you are, whether in the service or civilian or all these volunteers that help. There's some really great people out there. But I would say transfer your skills to a new generation, please. You know, apprentices and whatever. We need people to keep these going because of my generation, we're now getting on a bit.
Definitely. And there's incredible opportunities for young engineers in aviation, whether it's historic or modern. If you're listening and you're interested, just Google it, because there are a lot of apprenticeships, especially now that are being funded. But I think that's a great place to start wrapping this up. Paul, thank you so much. That has been wonderful fun. And I must say, you have a new book coming out, which I'm very excited to read, about Winkle Brown. When will we be able to get our hands on it?
Not for a while, not to 2022, because I'm a victim, as so many other people are, of the slowdown in the publishing business. They're basically publishing their backlists and the books they've already got in print. So it won't be till 2022. But I'm busily working. I'm looking at doing a few other projects book-wise at the moment, and there's always something to write about, which is the great thing, and always something with a bit of the Spitfire. So I contribute to the Spitfire Society magazine a lot. So if you're not a member of that, you ought to be. There's also, of course, the Hurricane Society. There isn't a Typhoon Society yet, is there?
There is a group that already is, the Hawker Typhoon Preservation Group.
Okay,
you can visit them at hawker-typhoon.com. They're doing great work.
So you know, there are all these places out here, and we're always looking for new and interesting stuff. And I keep finding it. There's a brilliant company up in Lancashire, CCM Motorcycles, who are building Spitfire motorcycles, and you can have your motorcycle in the colours of a Spitfire. And I'm the guy that tells you the colours that you can, or you come to me and say I'd like it to be. I come from St Austell, so I'd like the St Austell and District Spitfire marking scheme, which happens to be a Mark 7G PR aircraft that was painted pink, and the guy went, pink? Yep, afraid so. PR pink. So you know, it takes all sorts. If he actually goes ahead with it, he'll be, I think, a very brave biker.
But still, real men are not afraid of pink. Thank you so much for that, Paul. Like I said, the Winkle Brown book is out in 2022. We have not finished talking about the Spitfire. We will be back, hopefully, with more guests to talk about her legacy soon. But watch this space on that. To everyone who's been listening, thank you very much. And Matthew Bone signing off. And please remember, it was the Second World War. It was not a sequel. Thank you very much.